That night quickly became one of the most intense and unforgettable experiences of my life. It was an ordinary Saturday. The kind where everything seemed calm, but just beneath the surface something was waiting to break. It wasn't just the fun we were having, or the fact that I was spending time with my best friend. It was something deeper. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite place, but it made everything feel more intense, more alive. Chris and I had been friends for as long as I could remember. We were practically inseparable. We spent almost every weekend at each other's houses playing video games and talking. There was never anything between us, at least not on the surface, but deep down there was always something there, something I couldn't put my finger on. It was like a spark, small and barely noticeable, but always there, waiting. We were hanging out at his house like we always did. His parents were out for the night, which meant we had the house to ourselves. The night started out like any other. We ordered pizza, played some games, and joked around. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere started to change. The jokes got quieter, the silences got longer, and before I knew it, we were sitting in his living room, the TV on, in the dark. "I can't believe we're graduating soon," Chris said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, almost wistful. "Yeah," I replied, not sure what else to say. Graduation felt like a lifetime away, but it was creeping up on us faster than either of us wanted to admit. I shrugged. "Not really. I mean, I guess we'll figure it out, right?" Chris didn't say anything for a moment, his eyes drifting away from me and back to the TV, the silence stretching between us for the first time. That night it felt heavy, like there was something unsaid hanging in the air. "You know," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "things are going to change." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "After we graduate," he continued, still not looking at me, "we won't be around each other as much. Things won't be the same." The thought hit me like a punch. The thought hit me like a punch in the gut. I hadn't really thought about it before, but he was right. After high school, everything would change. We wouldn't be able to hang out like this anymore. Not every weekend. Not with the same ease we always had. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I guess you're right." We fell into silence again, but this time it felt different. I could feel the tension building, the unspoken words between us growing louder with each passing second. Without thinking, I moved closer to him on the couch. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it felt like a monumental shift. Like a monumental shift. Chris glanced over at me. His eyes locked with mine for a moment before he quickly looked away again. "Do you ever think about what it would be like if things were different?" His voice was so soft I almost didn't hear him. My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" His tone was casual, but there was something deeper beneath the surface. Like if we didn't have to follow the rules, you know? If we didn't have to worry about what everyone else thought. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was hinting at. There had always been something between us, but it had never been said out loud. It had never been said out loud. It was just there, simmering under the surface, but now it felt like he was bringing it out into the open. "Yes," I said quietly. "I guess I've been thinking about it." Chris didn't respond, but I could feel the tension between us growing, like a rubber band stretched too tight. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I didn't know what to do next. Everything felt like it was hanging in the balance, teetering on the edge of something I couldn't quite grasp, and then without warning he leaned over, closing the small distance between us, his shoulder brushing against mine. It was the lightest touch, barely noticeable, but it sent a shock wave through me. I held my breath waiting for what would happen next, unsure if I should say something, do something, or just let the moment pass, but it didn't. Chris moved even closer, our knees touching now, and I could feel the warmth radiating from him, my head spinning. My heart was pounding and I didn't know what to think. I had never thought about this before, but now that it was happening, I couldn't stop the flood of thoughts that were rushing through me. Before I could say anything, Chris spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Have you ever wondered what it would be like?" "What it would be like?" I asked. The air between us felt thick, like I could reach out and grab it. I didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do, but I could feel something building between us, something that had been there for a long time. Just waiting for the right moment. But the story didn't end. There was more. Chris leaned in closer. His face was now inches from mine, and I could feel his breath on my skin. It was a subtle thing, just a shift in the air, but it was enough to make my heart race, my mind screaming at me to pull away, to say something, anything to break the tension, but my body refused to listen. I was frozen in place, caught in the gravity of the moment, unable to move or think clearly. And then just like that, everything shifted. The next day, everything felt different. It was as if the air around us had. Chris and I didn't talk about what happened that night, but we both knew that something had changed, that there was no going back. And that realization weighed on me as I got dressed and headed out to meet him like we always did. Except now it wasn't like we always did. We had made plans to meet at the local basketball court, a place where we had spent countless afternoons shooting hoops and goofing off. It was our routine, something familiar in the midst of all the chaos that was senior year. But today, I wasn't sure if that familiarity would hold up after what had happened the night before. Chris was already there, dribbling a basketball absent-mindedly. He looked up as I approached, and for a split second I saw something in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. It was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Hey," he said, his voice casual, as if nothing had changed, as if we hadn't spent the night before teetering on the edge of something we couldn't come back from. "Hey," I replied, my throat dry. I wanted to say something to break the tension that had settled between us, but the words wouldn't come. Everything felt too fragile, as if one wrong move could shatter whatever fragile piece we had left. "You want to play?" Chris asked, tossing the ball my way. I caught it, the familiar weight grounding me for a moment. The weight of it grounded me for a moment. "Sure," I said, though my heart wasn't in it. We played for a while, falling into the rhythm of the game, but the tension between us never really went away, lingering in the spaces between our movements, in the way our eyes met, and then quickly vanished in the silence that followed. Every joke or comment. After a while, Chris called for a break, leaning against the chain-link fence that surrounded the court, and I joined him, wiping the sweat from my brow, my mind still racing with everything that had happened the night before. He said after a long pause, his voice quiet. "Last night, my heart stopped. I had hoped that we could avoid this conversation, that maybe we could pretend that nothing had happened, but deep down I knew that wasn't possible." "Yes," I said, not sure where to go from there. Chris was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Did it feel weird to you?" "Hard." My pulse quickened. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "What about you?" He shrugged, still not meeting my eyes. "I guess. We've been friends for so long." And now his voice trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, but I knew what he was trying to say. "Yeah," I said again, because I didn't know what else to say. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my mind spinning with a million different thoughts, but none of them made any sense. All I knew was that everything had changed and I didn't know how to deal with it. Finally, Chris spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think we can just go back to the way things were?" "Back to the way things were." I looked over at him, my heart sank. "I don't know," he nodded, his eyes were still glued to the ground. "Yummy." Neither. We stood there for a long time. I wanted to say something to reassure him that everything would be okay, but the truth was I didn't know if it would. I didn't know if we could leave. I was exhausted both physically and emotionally as I made my way home, my mind still racing with everything that had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about Chris, the way things had changed between us, what it all meant that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events of the day over and over again, unable to shake the feeling that things were spinning out of control, that I was on the edge of something I didn't understand, something I couldn't control. And then, just as I was about to fall asleep, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I grabbed it, squinting at the screen in the dim light. It was a text from Chris. "Are you awake?" My heart skipped a beat. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers hovered over the screen before I finally replied yes. There was a long pause before his next message came through. "Can we talk?" "We talk." I stared at the screen, my pulse quickened. I wasn't sure if I was ready for this conversation, but I knew avoiding it wasn't going to make things any easier. After a moment, I typed a reply, "Sure, what's up?" The three little dots that indicated he was typing appeared on the screen, and I held my breath waiting for his answer. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened last night." I swallowed hard. My fingers trembled as I typed my answer. Another long pause. "Then do you regret it?" I hadn't really thought about it in those terms, but now that he had asked, I couldn't avoid the question, could I? I regretted. I wasn't sure. Everything was so confusing, so tangled up in emotions I didn't fully understand. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally typed out an answer. "I don't know." "Do you?" This time the pause was even longer. I could feel my heart racing, my hands shaking as I waited for his answer number. I stared at the screen, my mind racing at the screen, my mind racing. I hadn't expected this. I don't know what I had expected, but it wasn't that. My pulse quickened, my stomach churned with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Before I could reply, another message came through. I think we want to figure this out together." My heart froze. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, if he meant that he wanted to talk about what had happened, or if he meant something more, but the way my heart was racing at the thought made it clear that I had my own answer. After a moment, I typed a reply, "Yes, me too," and there was a long silence. For a moment I wondered if the conversation was over, but then, just as I was about to put my phone down, another message came through. Do you want to come over tomorrow and we can talk about this in person? My heart skipped a beat. The thought of seeing him again, of talking about everything face to face, made my stomach churn. With nervous energy, but at the same time I knew that avoiding it was not an option. If we were going to figure this out, we needed to talk. Yes. I'll be there. The next day I found myself standing outside his house, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't been this nervous to see Chris in years, but now everything felt different. When I walked through the door, he opened it before I could knock, as if he had been waiting for me. His eyes met mine, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The tension between us was palpable, thick in the air, and I could feel my pulse quickening. We made our way to the living room and sat down on the couch where it all started a few days ago. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was charged with something I didn't fully understand. I don't know what it is, he continued, his eyes meeting mine. But I do know that I don't want to lose what we have. I don't want to lose you. His words hit me like a tidal wave, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I had been so caught up in the confusion and fear that I hadn't been able to breathe. I don't want to lose you either, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The room fell silent again. But this time it felt different. There was something hanging between us, something unspoken. Something hung between us, something unspoken but undeniable, and as we sat there side by side, I realized that whatever happened next, there was no going back. The moment I stepped into Chris's room, it felt like the air had thickened, heavy with the weight of everything unspoken. It pounded in my ears, knowing that whatever was about to happen would change everything between us. It wasn't just about the conversation anymore. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Chris closed the door behind me softly, his footsteps quiet as he moved across the room. We hadn't said much since I had arrived, but there was no need. The way his eyes locked on mine, the way he hovered just a few feet away, it was clear we were both thinking the same thing. It was inevitable. Now he sat down on the edge of his bed, the familiar crease of the mattress breaking the silence between us. Pulse racing as I tried to gather my thoughts, but it was no use. My mind was a blur, a swirl of emotions and desires that I hadn't wanted to face. Not like this, but here we were, and there was no turning back. Do you ever wonder? Chris's voice was soft, hesitant, but it cut through the thick air like a blade. What if this is something we don't have to ignore? Something we don't have to ignore. I blinked, unsure how to respond. My mouth felt dry. My hands trembled slightly as I pushed myself away from the door and took a few steps forward. The room felt smaller now, the space between us shrinking, and with every inch I came closer, my heartbeat quickened. Yes, I said, my voice, barely audible though I wasn't there to hear it. Barely audible, though I wasn't sure if it was the truth or just what I thought I should say. He smiled, but it wasn't the carefree grin I was used to. This smile was different, nervous, unsure. I'd been thinking about this a lot more than I probably should have. I swallowed, the tension between us growing with each passing moment. Second, we were standing on the edge of something I couldn't fully understand, something that scared me as much as it excited me. But now, looking into his eyes, I knew I wasn't the only one who felt this way, and I moved closer, finally sitting down next to him. Every second felt like an eternity, every breath shallow and uncertain. But now that we were here, sitting together in the silence of his room, there was no denying it. The movement was slow and deliberate, as if he was giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I closed the gap between us, our lips meeting in a kiss that felt like it had been years in the making. It wasn't just a kiss, it was everything. All the tension, the confusion, the fear, it all melted away. That single moment of connection, it was soft at first, hesitant, as if we were both unsure of what we were doing. But then something shifted and the kiss deepened. My heart raced, my mind spun, as I let myself get lost in the moment. It was as if the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only the two of us locked together in this moment that I knew would change everything. Chris's hand moved to the side of my face, gently cupping my cheek as the kiss grew more urgent. I could feel my body responding in ways I hadn't expected, my pulse quickening as the heat between us intensified. There was no hesitation now, no questioning. This was happening, and there was no stopping it. This was happening, and there was no stopping it. Our breaths were heavy, mingling in the space between us as we finally pulled back, both of us breathless and flushed. But it wasn't over. It was just beginning. I started to say something, but the words got stuck in my throat. What was there to say? Everything I felt, everything I wanted? It was all too much to put into words. Chris didn't say anything either. Instead, he leaned in again, his lips finding mine with a desperation that matched my own this time. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was all happening so fast, and yet it felt as if time had slowed down. Every movement, every breath felt deliberate, as if we were both hyperactive. Deliberately, as if we were both hyper-aware of what was happening but powerless to stop it. There was no going back now. No pretending this wasn't real. We broke apart again, our foreheads resting against each other as we caught our breath. I could feel the heat between us, the electric charge that seemed to pulse through the air. "I've wanted this for so long," Chris whispered, his voice low and raspy, sending shivers down my spine. I just didn't know how to say it. I closed my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. I too. I admitted the words barely audible. I didn't think you felt the same way." He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes searching mine. How could I not? The question hung in the air, and for a moment all I could do was stare at him, my mind spinning with the weight of everything that had happened between us. But there was no denying it anymore. This was real. Whatever this was, whatever we were, it was real. There was something so natural about it, something that felt like it had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to come to the surface. And now that it had, there was no going back. I knew Chris knew that, and in that moment nothing else mattered. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, locked in each other's embrace, our kisses growing more desperate, more urgent. There was no need for words now. All we needed to say was in the way our bodies moved together, the way our hearts raced in unison. And finally we pulled apart, both of us breathless, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us. I could see the same mix of emotions in Chris's eyes that I felt in my own: fear, excitement, uncertainty. But above all, there was something else, something deeper. "I don't want this to be a mistake," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's not Chris." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this, whatever this was more than just a moment of weakness, more than just confusion or curiosity. But I didn't know how to make sense of it all. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice shaking with the weight of the confession. We sat there in the silence of his room, the weight of everything that had happened between us hanging in the air. There were no easy answers, no way to make sense of what had just happened. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel I was alone, and at least we stayed that way. There was still so much left unsaid, so much we didn't understand. But in that moment it didn't matter because we had each other, and that was enough. The room was still, but everything felt different. Neither of us said anything for a while, the silence stretching out in front of us. But this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that had meaning, that held everything we hadn't been able to say before. Chris leaned back on the bed, his eyes focused on the ceiling. I could feel the weight of his presence beside me. I could feel the weight of his presence beside me, the gravity that had drawn us together still in the air. It was strange how quickly things had changed between us. We had spent years side by side, but tonight had turned everything upside down. "I didn't expect this," I finally said, breaking the silence, my voice quiet, uncertain as I tried to wrap my head around what had just happened. Chris didn't turn to look at me, but I saw a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Neither did I." He admitted it. "But now that it's happened, I don't know. It feels like it should." "Does this change everything?" I asked, my heart racing again. The moment of intimacy between us had changed things, but I wasn't sure if it would stay that way, if it could stay that way at all. He finally turned his head to look at me, his eyes soft but serious. "I don't think it changes anything," he said slowly, "but it changes us, and maybe that's not such a bad thing." His words hung in the air, and I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Maybe he was right. Maybe change wasn't something to fear, but something to embrace, something to lean on after all these years. Something to embrace, something to lean into. After all, we had always been close. Maybe this was just a new chapter in our story. I lay back beside him, the cool air of the room brushing against my skin, and stared up at the ceiling with him. "So where do we go from here?" I asked Chris, letting out a small laugh, the sound lightening the mood just a little. "I think we'll figure it out as we go along." That was the truth. I guess we'll figure it out as we go. That was the truth, wasn't it? There was no playbook for what we were experiencing, no clear path forward, but in a way that was freeing. We weren't bound by any expectations or rules. We could make this whatever we wanted it to be. "I guess that's all we can do," I replied, feeling the tension in my chest begin to ease. We lay there for what felt like hours, talking about everything and nothing. The conversation flowed easily between us, as it always had, but there was something deeper beneath the surface now, an understanding that we didn't have to define, but we both knew that things were different, in a good way. After a while, Chris sat up and looked at the clock on the wall. I had hesitated for a moment, Not because I didn't want to stay, but because I wasn't sure what staying would mean. Now we had crossed a line, one that couldn't be crossed again, and part of me wondered if spending the night would complicate things even more, but then again, maybe complicating things wasn't such a bad thing. Chris smiled, and for the first time in what felt like a long time, everything felt easy. We stood up and moved around the room in a comfortable rhythm as we got ready for bed. The silence between us filled with a newfound understanding. No awkward looks, no lingering tension, just a quiet comfort in knowing that we were in this together. It wasn't the first time we'd shared a bed, but now it felt different. Not awkward, not tense, just new, like we'd stepped into a part of our friendship that we hadn't known before. It wasn't a perfect solution, it wasn't some grand revelation, but it was enough to know that we weren't alone in this, enough to know that whatever came next, we would face it together. I closed my eyes, my mind finally settling as sleep began to pull me under. "I'm glad it was you," he said, his words filling me with a quiet reassurance, and I found myself smiling softly. Eyes still closed. "I'm glad too," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the darkness as I drifted off to sleep. Distant, and what mattered most was that we had faced this moment together. That was enough for now. I never thought things would change between us, but after that night nothing was ever the same. And while the future feels uncertain, one thing is clear: we have crossed a line we can't come back from, but maybe, just maybe, this is where we were always meant to be.